Brian, stay with us because we want to talk to Stephen Donnelly, independent TD for Wicklow and East Carlow. He's in our Dáil studio. Stephen Donnelly, good afternoon.
Hi, Richard.
From what you've heard from Brian Dowling, is that a good way to go, if that's in fact the way the government is going, that they would initially ask this independent specialist in liquidations to come in and have a look at it, and then subsequently perhaps it could be kicked on to the Public Accounts Committee?
I'd agree with the first bit, Richard. Clearly this is a highly technical area and specialist skill is required. Specialist skills in finance and liquidation, probably in contract law and so forth, are required. I don't like the sound of something that goes to the CNAG's office and then maybe comes back into Parliament. Ultimately, the people tasked in the Constitution for taking care of public money is not the CNAG. It's not the Minister for Finance. It's Dáil Éireann. So this thing has to come to Dáil Éireann. Now, if it comes to PAC or it comes to the Finance Committee, that's absolutely fine because they are committees of the Oireachtas. But this, the home that this must be investigated in is the Oireachtas.
There's also the question then of what's included and who they speak to. There are obvious difficulties. If you want a speedy resolution, if you want answers quickly, you limit it to Siteserv. If you take in other companies and other sales, other transactions, the danger is it becomes this unwieldy beast and the whole process could be dragged out for months.
Well, you kick both off at the same time. Siteserv is one example of a transaction where the Department of Finance FOI material has raised some very serious concerns. However, there are other things that came out in the FOI. For example, the department says, and I'm quoting, that they are concerned at the number of large transactions that have been poorly executed. And on the same page, they believe the decisions taken by IBRC resulted in a less optimum return for the bank. Now, let's bear in mind, Richard, the management team in IBRC was managing €40 billion of state assets because we had full ownership of the bank at that stage. So yes, Siteserv needs to be looked at, but the Department of Finance are saying they have serious questions about a number of large transactions. Now, on an asset base of 40 billion, if we're off by 2%, we're up in the 800 million territory. So under no circumstances should this be limited to Siteserv. There needs to be a very full look at this. And I have to say, just listening to Minister Noonan's comment that he got assurances from the Chief Executive, I mean, that is a shocking thing for the Minister for Finance of the day to say. Concerns are raised, and they're all in the FOIs. Concerns were raised specifically with the Chief Executive. Now, Minister Noonan presumably had this in writing from his officials, as we do now. So he's taking assurances from someone who concern is being expressed about. So politically, we've been through some of the financial issues, but politically, Richard, there's very serious questions need to be answered. Number one, did Michael Noonan tell the rest of the cabinet about this? So it's all well and good for the Taoiseach, the Joan Burton, to stand up and say we need a commission of inquiry, but did she know? Because if Catherine Murphy hadn't done this work, none of this would be coming out. Minister Noonan, I presume, would feel under no obligation to be telling anybody about this or to be calling for it to be investigated.
Do you also then need, and this is in relation to the Siteserv element of this inquiry, if that goes ahead first or even in parallel with everything else, do you need to talk to all of those other bidders, some of whom say that they were deliberately excluded or strangely excluded from the process?
Yeah, there's no question that you do, and my understanding is one of them even went to the Competition Authority with an official complaint. It's probably not that big a list, but of course you would want to talk to all of the bidders. And
you need to talk to Alan Dukes, you need to talk to Mike Ainsley, and who else should be on the list then?
I don't know. The FOI report from the department raises concerns about the Chief Executive. It says, and I quote, "The performance of management in executing these transactions raises the question of the effectiveness of the CEO. The poor management displayed in a number of these items, along with increased public concern and political scrutiny, is damaging the credibility of the institution." So I don't know, Richard. What we have is heavily redacted documents. Maybe a step would be for the department and for the minister to produce the full documentation, so we could better answer that question.
Stephen, thanks for that. Stephen Donnelly there, independent TD, and for Wicklow and East Carlow. Brian Dowling is still with us. Brian, apart from everything else, this is a bit of a political mess that the coalition didn't need at this time.
Absolutely. I think many of us would have noted over the last number of weeks, Richard, that since the beginning of this year, the government has had a pretty good run in terms of no controversies after a fairly torrid year last year. this has now literally blown up around them. And I think the political imperative from the government's point of view would be to get this into some form of inquiry that commands some kind of political consensus and maybe back into the public. My understanding is the intention is that it would go back into the Public Accounts Committee once they can devise the mechanism to allow it. I just think one final point perhaps, and if you pick up from where Stephen was a second ago, in all the documentation that we've seen so far, Alan Dukes has said there was no impropriety, there was no wrongdoing in this. And there's nothing in the FOI material that we have seen to date that suggests anything of that nature. If anything, the officials in the Department of Finance are questioning the quality of the commercial decision making by IBRC. Now, obviously, people in IBRC may well challenge that,
Sure.
but that seems to be where their concerns rest.
Brian Dowling, thanks indeed. We'll take a break. We're back in